Hello, everybody. It is Kyla here from Nutritional Revolution, and I have an amazing guest for you guys today. I have Dr. Jason Karp, and he is quite the rock star. He is an author of 13 books, TEDx speaker, PhD in exercise physio. He has his MBA, master's in kinesiology. He has several pieces of literature published in journals. And he is currently living in Kenya, coaching distance runners there, and is the founder of Kyniska Running, which is a coaching platform solely for female runners, utilizing cutting edge science based on women's physiology. So there's so much to dive into there, Dr. Jason, but could you, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit? Let us know how you got into this cool world that you're in.
Well, thanks for the great introduction. I swear I didn't pay you to say that.
Yeah.
And for me, it started really just when I was a kid. I started running track. And I played a lot of baseball. Baseball was actually my first love.
Awesome.
I was really into baseball even before I started running track. And playing all these sports, I also played a lot of soccer, and I fell in love with the science of athletic performance. I always found it fascinating how elite athletes can do what they do. And one of the first questions I had was how a baseball pitcher throws a curveball. You know, how do you make the ball move like that in the air? And it's all physics. It's fascinating to me. And then when I started running track, I became interested in why some people can run faster than others, and so that never left me. I was placed on a yellow brick road from a very young age that I followed, and I'm still following all these years later.
Wow. Yeah.
Yes, I'm lucky that I'm one of those people who knew from a young age what field I wanted to pursue. Even when I was in college, I met a lot of people who still had no idea what they wanted to do, and that's normal. There are a lot of people in college have no idea. And I was very lucky that I didn't know like exactly what job I would have, but I knew the subject matter that I wanted to immerse myself in. So I was very lucky that I found something at a young age that I became so curious about and passionate about, and I just followed it all these years.
Amazing. Amazing. And when you were doing your PhD, what was some of the research you were looking at there?
Oh, I focused on endurance performance. And so, I was very careful for all the schools I went to. I was very careful in particular about where I went to school because I wanted to study under the best, and I wanted to study under the people who were doing the same research that I wanted to do. And that's really how you choose a PhD program. You choose it for the person rather than for the school. You want to go, you work under a specific advisor who's doing the research that you want to do. And so all of my research was on endurance performance. Some of it was on the nutritional aspects, like my famous chocolate milk study. That got a lot of press.
Amazing.
So my claim to fame, I guess, is that I was the lead author on the first published study on the effectiveness of chocolate milk as a post-workout recovery drink.
Amazing. Amazing. I've read that plenty of times in all my clinical nutrition textbooks, for sure.
When that first came out, it got a lot of press. All the fitness magazines, they latched on to that, and because it's kind of like a quirky thing, you drink chocolate milk to recover from a workout. But since our study was published, then a lot of other studies have come out since, and they all found the same things that we found, that it's a very effective product to use for recovery.
Amazing.
My dissertation research was on the coordination of breathing and stride rate in runners.
Oh, cool.
Entrainment. And so there's been a lot of research on four-legged animals and how they entrain their breathing to their stride rate, pretty much because they have to, because the movement of their thorax, of their chest cavity, is affected by their front two limbs. But in humans, there's more anatomical separation between our legs and our chest cavity.
So interesting. So interesting.
It turns out that humans do it as well as four-legged animals. We don't as tightly couple it as four-legged animals, but it seems to be something that happens with training, that people just subconsciously start to coordinate the two rhythms.
Wow. And totally not the topic we're supposed to be going today, but I have to ask, because you just mentioned that that piece of research. What are your thoughts on the mouth breathing versus nasal breathing in humans?
Yeah, it doesn't really matter, because that's a big myth in the running world, is that when you're at sea level, I mean, right now I'm at high altitude, so it matters more. But when you're at sea level, breathing is not the limitation for runners. It's not about how much air your lungs can hold. Your blood is nearly 100% saturated with oxygen, even when you're running as fast as you can. And so it's really the cardiovascular limitation. It's the responsibility of the cardiovascular system to send more blood and more oxygen to the working muscles. It's not a matter of how much air you can get in. Oxygen has no problem diffusing from the environment into our lungs because of the big pressure difference. When you go to high altitude, like if you're standing at the top of Mount Everest, there's practically no pressure difference between the atmospheric air and what's inside your lungs. And so it's very difficult to get oxygen into your lungs. And so breathing matters a lot when you're very, very high altitude. But for altitudes that people are at, that they're running at, breathing is not the limiting factor. And so it doesn't matter if you breathe through your nose or in through your mouth. Because the oxygen is going to diffuse from the environment into your lungs anyway, regardless of what you do, because that's how it works.
Wow. That makes sense. It makes perfect sense. Right. So, talking about altitude, I know you're tuning in right now from Kenya. So, tell us a little bit about what drew you to Kenya to start coaching. What altitude are you at? I'm curious to mention. Tell us about that.
I'm at 7,900 feet, which in Kenyan's language is 2,400 meters. They do everything in meters here.
Yes.
So it's just a little bit, just under 8,000 feet, which is high. I mean, you definitely feel it when you run. I feel it every day when I run. But this also goes back to when I was a kid, that, starting to run, everybody hears about the Kenyan runners, and, there's a mystique about them. And so I grew up hearing about the Kenyan runners and always wanted to learn about them and why they're so good. And then in 2019, I came here for a running camp just for myself, because I wanted to experience the Kenyan running culture. And it was back then in 2019 that I got this idea that maybe I can actually move here to coach, because I got to see what goes on here. So I'm in a rural town called Iten, Iten, and this is the epicenter of Kenyan running. And so imagine if all of the best U.S. distance runners all lived in one small rural town in the middle of America. This is that times 10. Because what is so special is not only are all the runners congregated into this one town, but there's also a lot of depth of talent here, much more so than in the U.S. Look around here, there's a male who can run 2:10 or 2:12 for a marathon. There's a woman who can run 2:25 to 2:30. I mean, everybody runs that here. It's not it's not an outlier like it is in the U.S. So there's depth of talent here.
Amazing.
And so after I went to the camp, I got this idea, and then I had a few hiccups because COVID happened, and so I had to wait. Because the big thing here too is they all train in groups. No one's training alone. So when COVID happened, everything got shut down here. They weren't allowed to train in groups anymore. So I had to wait until that let up, and then I had started the MBA. You mentioned that in the intro, that I went back to school in 2019 to do an MBA, and so I couldn't leave while I was doing that. So I had to wait for that to be done. And so I was able to finally work things out. And then in November of last year, I was able to move here. So it's been great. I mean, it's just a fascinating environment to coach. There's so much talent here. And there's no recreational runners here. No one's running to qualify for the Boston Marathon. They're running because it's their dream to win the Boston Marathon. And running is their only way out of poverty. And so there's nothing going on in this town except running. I mean, that's what this place is known for. And so it makes this place a pretty unique environment. I mean, there's cows and sheep and roosters and the best distance runners in the world.
Yes. Amazing. And what is your theory as to why, do you think that drive to run to get out of poverty, like you're saying, is that the driver, or is there something else that has made them, do you think, lead up to just be naturally really good runners?
I mean, that is the driver, but you have to have the talent. I mean, you can train as hard and as long as you want, but if you don't have the talent, it's not going to matter.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
there's this one slice of the Kenyan population. I mean, there's a lot of tribes in Kenya. It's a very tribal
Mm-hmm.
country with about 40 different tribes.
Mm.
And the Kalenjin tribe are those are the ones who are the distance runners.
Okay.
So they're not. Most Kenyans don't run. People think that Kenya, everybody runs.
Yeah.
But there's 39 other tribes that don't run.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
it's just Kalenjins that are genetically suited for this. They have
Amazing.
very thin legs. Like if you watch the runners in the Olympics for
Mm-hmm.
Kenya, almost all of them are Kalenjin.
Mm.
They have the perfect body type for running. And I know you want to get into talking about nutrition, and I think that affects them too, is that they're
Yeah.
metabolically very efficient. They eat
Mm.
very, very little, but
Mm.
they're able to train at a very high level.
Wow.
And so a few different things going on that allow them to do what they do. But
Wow.
of course, it all starts with genetics. I mean, even in the US, it's the same thing. The best
Yeah.
runners are the best because of their genetic potential, not because of the training that they do. The
Mm-hmm.
training just brings those genetics to the forefront.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what age range are you working with down there?
20s and 30s.
Okay. And men and women?
Yeah, I don't have as many women right now in my group. I'm trying to recruit some more.
Yeah.
It's a little bit harder to find women, even though they're here. I mean, they're
Yeah.
still running. But the men, I mean, there's much more men, and there's more depth of talent with the
Yeah.
men. But the women, if they have the ability, then there's more opportunities because
Right.
managers are always looking to manage women and get them racing opportunities, and
Wow.
because women, even in Kenya, there's a lot of depth of competition, but
Mm.
still less than what there is for the men. So
Mm-hmm.
the women have a greater potential to really be successful because they don't have the huge depth of competition that the men
Wow.
have.
Yeah. Wow. That makes sense. And so from a day-to-day diet perspective, when you first moved down there, was there any kind of like major differences you noticed? I mean, you mentioned chickens and stuff running around the street. What's their
Yeah.
primary like daily diet like?
It's very, very basic. I mean, they don't have refrigerators.
Mm.
They don't have, the same kind of cooking supplies that we have in the U.S. And so, everything is fresh. I mean, there's no
Mm-hmm.
processed food. They don't have
Mm-hmm.
freezers and refrigerators to keep that stuff
Right.
in. They drink milk directly from the cow,
Wow.
and that's their major source of protein is the milk.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have the money for meat. I mean, they have meat around here because you have
Mm-hmm.
cows, you have chickens, but most of the athletes don't have money for that.
Yeah.
So they get their protein mostly from milk,
Mm.
and they eat a lot of beans and rice. And the famous thing that they have here that they swear by is called ugali,
Mm.
which is just like a mixture of maize and water. It's
Mm.
very bland. It has
Mm-hmm.
like no taste at all.
Yeah.
Like imagine a porridge that is hardened, like a hardened stiff porridge.
Oh,
That's what
goodness.
ugali is.
Okay.
And it's the blandest thing you've ever had, but they swear by it. They act
Yeah.
like, oh, it gives you strength. But so they eat a lot of that because it's
Yeah.
extremely cheap. So yeah, they don't have a lot of. They eat very, very little. The total calories that they consume is very small, but
Wow.
it's very, very high in carbohydrate. It's almost
Yeah.
100% carbohydrate.
Wow.
It's remarkable the volume and intensity of training that they're able to perform
Yeah.
on so calories every day.
Yeah. Wow. What do you think the average like runner that you're working with, like what are we talking about in terms of height and weight that they're sitting at when you say small? What can we picture here?
Their height is the same as the rest of the world's population, but they're very thin. They don't have a
Mm-hmm.
lot of muscle mass. So
Yeah.
if you ever watch, during the Olympics, you watch the Kenyans run.
Mm-hmm.
Their legs are like sticks.
Yeah.
Their arms are
Yeah.
like sticks.
Yeah.
But that helps them as a distance runner.
Mm-hmm.
There's no strength training going on here,
Yeah.
except like Ilya Kipchoge sometimes will post things on Instagram about him lifting weights. So people think that, well, because he lifts some weights, everybody lifts weights here, but they
Right.
don't.
Right.
They don't have
Yeah.
access to that stuff. They run an enormous amount, and they
Mm-hmm.
run on very rugged terrain here.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but their limbs are very slight. They're very thin,
Yeah.
and that helps. I mean, that's good for running economy because the more
Mm-hmm.
muscle mass you have on your legs, especially the lower part of your legs, like your calf and around your ankles, the more meat that you have there, then the more oxygen it costs to pick the leg up and put it down and pick it up and put it down.
Yeah.
So, it's advantageous to have very thin legs.
Mm-hmm. Is
Always
there
like
some,
Kenyan. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to.
no worries, go ahead.
I've always likened the Kenyan runners to thoroughbred race horses. If you ever watch horse races, it's the same thing. They have very
Mm-hmm.
thin legs.
Mm-hmm.
They have a
Mm-hmm.
huge aerobic engine with very thin legs. And
Yeah.
the Kenyans it's very similar, and that's why they can run so fast. It doesn't cost them a lot to pick their leg up all the time.
Right. Yeah. Do you think that also increases their kind of like cooling efficiency too, their surface area to mass kind of ratio, or?
Yeah, I mean that too is remarkable here that they get cold very easily. Like
Okay.
even though every day it's been in the 70s here, it's like the same temperature because we're right near the equator. So
Mm-hmm.
there's not much fluctuation
Okay.
between winter and summer. And
Mm.
so for the 5 months I've been here, it's been between 70 and 79 degrees every day.
Okay.
And
That's
they
nice.
go out, yeah, that's nice for us. They go
Yeah.
outside to run in the morning, and you would think it's 30 degrees outside the way they're
Oh,
dressed.
yeah.
I mean, they're dressed in a hat, they're wearing a windbreaker, they're wearing tights. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's unbelievable how the perception of the climate for them versus us, it's
Yeah.
very different.
Yeah.
I'm in short t-shirt every day running, but they're dressed as if it's like really, really cold outside.
Right. Does their summers get much hotter than 79 degrees, or does it stay that 365
Oh
days a
yeah,
year?
I'll say that the whole year. Yeah,
Oh,
because we're
interesting.
just north of. Yeah, I mean, some of Kenya is north of the equator and some is south.
Mm-hmm.
So where I am, it's a little bit north. So the seasons are the same as the U.S., but
Wow.
I'm not that far north of the
Yeah.
equator. So there's much fluctuation
Mm.
between winter and summer and spring
Mm.
and fall. Pretty much the same temperature all year.
Wow. Wow. Interesting. So, kind of on the diet perspective, is there anything that you mentioned the maize with the water and, carb dominant sources? Do they have any techniques that they utilize like like run practice sessions or nothing?
No, so they run twice a day.
Mhm.
Their first morning run, they always eat fat. They always run fasted because
Mm.
just out of well, number one, the money, and number two, other logistical thing. They don't get up 2 or 3 hours before their
Mhm.
workout to eat.
Mhm.
And so even though we're doing hard workouts first thing in the morning, they're doing them on an empty stomach, which is
Mhm.
pretty remarkable.
Mhm.
But they're capable of doing it.
Wow.
And then after the workout, usually they'll have some chai tea. Kenyan chai tea is very popular here.
Mm.
So they get some protein in the milk that's in the
Mhm.
chai tea, and
Awesome.
then they have like very basic stuff to eat.
Mhm.
Maybe some rice or whatever they can scrounge up,
Mhm.
and then they take a nap, and
Wow.
then they run later in the day again. They'll go out for
Yeah.
their second run,
Wow.
and that's the pattern every day. They're running twice a day, but
Wow.
they're always doing their hard runs as the first run of the day, and so they're doing them without having food beforehand.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible. I mean, you can tell just by the way you're talking about it too. They're really, I mean, they're pushing themselves to,
Yeah.
like you're saying, get out of poverty. Goodness. And
It's
do you,
interesting because, like, in the U.S., that we have a million reasons to run.
yeah,
They have one. They don't run because they like it. They don't run because they want to run.
yeah.
I mean, if you ask them, if it weren't for the fact that they could potentially get out of poverty, they wouldn't run at all.
Mm-hmm.
Perceive that this is their only way out, and so they run even if they
Wow.
don't like it. It's just
Yeah.
it's so cultural here. It's so deep in their culture that this is what you do to get out of poverty. You run.
Wow. Yeah. That is pretty amazing. And I mean, so obviously they've never seen a sports gel or a recovery shake or none of that stuff. It's
That
just,
stuff they don't have access to that here.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And what do they do about their hydration? Is there any like salt access or what is that like for them?
Just water. I mean, it's just water.
Yeah.
We
And
don't have all the
rely on
fancy
salt.
sports drinks here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Goodness.
water.
Is there, I don't know how shipping works, but is there the ability to get like stuff to you? Like,
Yeah, potentially. I mean, nobody has mailing addresses here.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah. I mean, like
Yeah.
even the streets, they don't have names. They don't have
Mm,
numbers. There's no numbers on the
yeah.
homes here. It's like, so I don't even know how they get it delivered.
Wow.
But But yeah, I mean, people do ship stuff here. It's expensive.
I
It's
bet.
very
Yeah.
expensive to ship something from the U.S. to Kenya.
Wow.
Most of the stuff that they get from visiting runners. Because the other thing that makes this place unique is that runners from all over the world will come here because they want to get a taste of training with the Kenyans.
Yeah.
A lot of guest houses. That's where I'm living at. Is a guest house. So there's elite
Yeah.
athletes here, and so I'm
Wow.
meeting Olympians all the time. I mean, right now there's a woman she's originally from Eritrea. She runs for Sweden. She
Wow.
ran the last Olympic Games.
Wow.
Weeks ago, there was another guy from Eritrea who runs for Switzerland, and he's running 2 Olympic Games. And so there's a lot of Olympians that come from other places, and so they bring stuff with them. They bring shoes, they bring clothes, and then they give them to the Kenyan runners.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing. Yeah. I can imagine that's got to be, you can't just do it. No Amazon ordering from Kenya.
Right.
Imagine. Definitely not.
Yeah.
You have to be smart about how you get stuff in there. Yeah, I think that's something too. I mean, I know we talked a little bit before we started hitting record, but you were mentioning trying to get, I mean, talking about poverty and getting these athletes tools to help perform and things of that nature. You mentioned sponsorship stuff. Could you tell us a little bit about that and the listeners so they can maybe find ways to help you out?
So the way it works here, I'm learning a lot in the last 5 months. It's a very complex system here. That the way it works is that ideally, in an ideal situation, the athlete would get connected to a manager who's connected to a shoe company. And then you have a coach, a manager, and the shoe company working together to support the athletes, getting them racing opportunities in other countries. And either the manager will pay for the athlete's travel, or the event management company, who's ever putting on the race, that they'll pay. So it can work that way. It can work 2 ways. But that's the ideal situation here, to get the athletes covered, and so that they don't have to worry about that, and they can focus on the training.
Wow.
And so I didn't have that situation yet here. And so when I first got here, I realized pretty quickly that you need financial support here. I started my own personal GoFundMe page. I just started my own fundraiser, and I've been getting donations.
Yeah.
But ideally, for long term, I would need to be connected to, either a shoe company or some other type of company that supports runners, and a manager for the athletes. But it's a lot of competition. The athletes have to be so good in order to attract a manager, because that's how the manager makes money. They lay out their money, they pay for the athlete's travel, and then hopefully the athlete will win the race, win prize money, and the manager takes a cut.
Yeah. Wow.
Managers want to work with athletes who have that potential to go to major races and win a lot of money.
Wow. So we can include your GoFundMe link too in the show notes for people to check that out. And then if there's a way, so you mentioned the managers, like, are you the manager for your coaching group, or are you looking for outside additional managers? You're saying
outside. And so I just came here to coach, so I'm not a manager.
I see.
But that's part of my focus here, is that once they're good enough, I already have a few who are good enough, then I've been reaching out to potential managers to connect them to those people. But it all starts with, and that's why this situation here almost creates a desperate need to be good, because these athletes know that, well, if I can just get fast enough, I can change my life. I can get a manager, they can bring me to Europe or to the US, I can win money, and I can completely change my life forever. And so there's this insane, desperate need to become as fast as possible here.
Yeah. Wow. So is there a way to get the managers in contact with you?
Yeah, well, I reach out to them.
And
people see, like, there are people, they're usually in other countries, but they have a close look on what's going on here. Like, there are some pretty well-known managers who manage a lot of the athletes here. And so they're always looking. So like I keep telling the athletes, you get fast enough and the opportunities will come to you. Now I'm doing a lot of the legwork and reaching out to people. But if they get fast enough, they're going to get noticed, and then the manager is going to want to work with them.
Wow. Well, we'll definitely put that in the show notes for people who want to check that out and donate and help out your runners that you have down there and help get them some resources and maybe travel to races and things like that. I think that would be rad.
That's going to be very helpful.
Yeah. So now we're kind of halfway through the session. So I want to make sure we get some women's nutrition or women's physiology covered as well. And I know one of the books you wrote was Running for Women, and you dove into all things like menstrual cycle physiology, hydration, body temperature, thermoregulation, metabolism, all of those things. I don't even know where I want to start. Is there a favorite topic you had from the book that you want to dive into?
Yeah, the menstrual cycle. So this also takes me back a while that, and people think it's kind of funny because I'm a guy. And so they think it's funny that I have such an interest in women's physiology, but most of the researchers in this space are also male. And, look at how many gynecologists are male. So there's actually quite a lot of men who have an interest in women's biology and physiology. It's not so rare as it may seem on the surface.
Right.
I got this idea when I was working on my PhD. I was taking a year of classes in the medical school with the first year med students, and we were learning a lot about reproductive physiology. And at that same time, I was also coaching this one female runner who was trying to get to the Olympic trials in the marathon. Mm-hmm. And so I was putting all these pieces together and realized that, how women perform at different times of the month changes based on their physiology. And so that's what kind of gave me the idea for the book was both I was studying this academically and I was also coaching somebody who was trying to get to a pretty high level. And I saw the things that she was going through with her period. And so I started researching it a lot more and became much more interested in it. And so there's a lot there. A man's training program can be pretty static because men don't have the enormous fluctuation of hormones every month that women have. So for women, there's really a lot to sink your teeth into in this subject area. That there are different times of the month that really are better for endurance performance, especially long endurance performance. And there are times of the month where it's not so good for endurance performance. And if a woman is in tune with that and understands that, you can exploit that and you can plan the training around that. So it's a fascinating subject, I find.
Yeah. So you mentioned long, more aerobic efforts versus maybe short and fast work. Do you, what phase of the cycle would that be when someone should maybe prioritize the longer aerobic efforts?
So it turns out that for the more anaerobic kinds of activities, that's not really affected by the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle seems to only affect the aerobic, especially longer aerobic, like half marathon performance, and then the training that goes along with that. So in a very brief nutshell, the 2 weeks following the woman's period leading up to when she has ovulation, that's the best time to really push the endurance work as estrogen rises. So the first 2 weeks of the follicular phase, and estrogen, it starts out low during the period and then it increases all the way through the first 2 weeks until it peaks right before ovulation. And then it drops pretty rapidly again. And there's a smaller secondary peak over the next 2 weeks of estrogen. And that's the luteal phase. And then the sister hormone, progesterone, is flatlined and low for the first 2 weeks. And then progesterone is the dominant hormone during the second 2 weeks during the luteal phase. And so the big, and of course, this is a generalization, but because every woman might be slightly different. But in general, endurance performance is better when estrogen is the dominant hormone, and is worse when progesterone is the dominant hormone. So that tells you then how you can plan your training and even your racing around the menstrual cycle. Like the first 2 weeks, especially week 2, when estrogen is really rising, it's a good time to really push the endurance work. And then you back off during the second 2 weeks when progesterone is rising. So, you can align your weeks of your training cycle with the weeks of the menstrual cycle and put those two pieces of the puzzle together and design the training that way.
Yeah. Wow. And so I would imagine too, this is probably a bit of what you do for the Kyniska Running coaching as well, right? Is looking into all of this stuff.
I started this company last year and have brought on other coaches, and it's a whole women's specialty run coaching company. And the name came from a Kyniska. It was the chariot racer who was the first female winner of the ancient Olympic Games in ancient Greece.
Wow.
So I named it after her. So that's where the name
Amazing.
comes from. But yeah, it's all about women's specialty coaching, training women around their menstrual cycle.
Amazing. And you mentioned hydration changes through the menstrual cycle. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's mostly because of progesterone. So during the second 2 weeks, progesterone, it looks like a bell curve. Right after ovulation, progesterone is low, but then it starts increasing all the way through week 3, and then it peaks at week 3, and then it drops the second part of the bell curve. It drops during week 4. And so the reason why women feel bloated coming into their period is because of that rapid drop in progesterone. And so the opposite effect happens when progesterone is increasing. There's a water loss, and then there's water retention on the opposite side of the bell curve when progesterone is decreasing. So that also changes women's hydration needs. That too can be matched with the menstrual cycle, so women know when they need to hydrate more versus when they need to hydrate less. Yeah, there's a lot, and then what happens when women don't have a menstrual cycle or when it becomes irregular? I mean, you could spend an hour just talking about that.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a lot going on, and it also affects glycogen storage in women. At different times of the month, women are better at storing glycogen for longer races like marathon. Yeah, there's a lot. The hormonal affect a lot about women's physiology. The biggest difference between men and women as far as the physiology is in metabolism, that women are better at relying on fat for energy, and they conserve the limited store of carbohydrate. Like if a man and a woman go and run together, the man will use more carbohydrate to support that speed, whereas the woman will rely more on fat. And that has to do with estrogen. Estrogen shifts metabolism to a greater reliance on fat.
Interesting. And so you mentioned the carbohydrates being able to kind of load those a little bit better during certain phases. That would be that follicular phase when estrogen, progesterone are lower.
And one other difference between like carbohydrate loading between men and women is that like leading up into a marathon, men only need to consume more of their total calories, a greater percentage of their total calories from carbohydrate, whereas women need to also consume more total calories. It's not just the increase in the percentage of calories that come from carbohydrate, it's also the more total calories.
So someone who's tapering their training leading into a race, a woman, we'll say, they should be eating more calories, and specifically in the form of carbohydrates, those extra calories, or does it matter?
Yeah, I mean, so both. You're increasing the percentage that comes from carbohydrate as well as you're consuming more total calories in general.
Yeah, I think that can be a mistake I've seen people make where they'll taper the training and then they think that they also just don't need to load up as much calories, right? Because they're not putting as much energy out, but for the loading purposes. And so what about in the luteal phase? So when estrogen and progesterone are a little bit higher, what if someone is racing and doing a longer race? Is like, should they try and carb load with extra calories, or is there a way to mitigate that or get around that?
No matter which phase you're in, you still need a lot of carbohydrate. You can't get around that, especially for longer races. But the biggest thing during the luteal phase is thermoregulation, because progesterone is responsible for increasing body temperature. So like say a woman is going to run a long race like a marathon or ultra marathon in hot humid conditions right in the middle of the luteal phase when progesterone is peaking. That's not the most ideal time to do it, because a woman's set point temperature is going to be slightly higher. And so that means that you have to reach a higher temperature in order to dissipate that heat. And so it's not the most ideal time to run a long race. But it all depends. I mean, if it's not a hot day, it may not be a big issue,
right?
Because you're only talking about a degree or two difference in temperature. But if it is a hot, humid day, then it's not the most ideal time to do that.
Interesting. And when it comes to, like you mentioned, like muscle functioning too in your book, how does that alter their ability to, I mean, they were talking high intensity muscle functioning during different phases of the cycle, or what is that?
So yeah, so that doesn't seem to be affected by the
Mm,
menstrual cycle, like the actual muscle functioning, the strength, the power, the speed,
mm.
that kind of stuff. A woman doesn't really have to consider her menstrual cycle to change how she trains, because
Okay.
that anaerobic kind of stuff doesn't seem to be affected by the menstrual cycle. It's
Interesting.
only
Okay.
really the endurance, and
Mm,
that's mostly because of the negative effects of progesterone and the positive effects of estrogen, and how that affects aerobic endurance and
mm,
metabolism.
hmm. And so how would this affect, I think you covered this in your book, was like, what about pregnancy or once we get into perimenopause and into menopause? Like, how do these things change? We're talking about like hydration and thermal
Yeah.
regulation.
Yeah, it changes a lot of stuff, because like pregnancy, now some of the blood flow is going to support the growing fetus.
Mm,
And so the way a woman trains during the 3 trimesters is very different.
mm,
Maybe they
mm,
don't have to change so much during the first trimester. And again, even with this, there's a lot of individuality.
mm-hmm.
Some women can't do any exercise during most of their pregnancy, while a lot of women can run right up until the day they give birth. And so
Right.
there's a lot of individuality. But in general, the first trimester, usually you don't have to change too much,
Mm-hmm.
but starting in the second trimester and definitely in the third, that's when changes have to be made to the training. You can't train at as high of an intensity, because you can imagine the situation that you have all this blood flow going to your muscles. But when you're pregnant, especially later in the pregnancy, a lot of the heart's cardiac output is going to support the fetus.
Mm,
So by necessity, you can't train at a high enough intensity, because you'll be, quote, stealing blood away
mm,
from the placenta where it needs to go.
mm-hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's why women can't train it as high. Plus, you also have situations where the change in the center of gravity, because you have
Mm, mm-hmm.
the growing belly, and so that changes, that pushes your center of gravity forward, and so there are orthopedic issues and balance issues. And so yeah, in the book I go through all the different the 3 different trimesters, and show how the physiology changes, and then how the training changes. And then you mentioned menopause, and so that's a whole nother
Yeah.
topic of conversation. The biggest issue during menopause is that women no longer have estrogen
Mm,
fluctuating throughout their body,
mm-hmm.
and so believe it or not, estrogen more than anything else has the greatest effect on bone health.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we see a lot of senior citizens who they get fractures very easily,
Mm-hmm.
because their bone density dramatically decreases.
Mm,
Whereas in a man's bone density will also decrease as they age, but
mm-hmm.
not to the same extent as a woman's.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, men start off with a denser bones to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
For women, because they lose the protective effect of estrogen on their bones, they need to do other things to try to protect their bones. Like strength training is extremely important for older women.
Mm-hmm.
Every woman, I mean, even every man over 50 should be strength training,
Mm,
because of the effect that heavy resistance training has on the bones. It makes it more
mm-hmm.
dense.
Wow.
And then
Interesting.
also you can get into discussion of muscle fiber type, and how you lose the speed and the power, because
Mm,
the fast twitch fibers atrophy as you
mm-hmm.
get older. And so women need to do more higher intensity stuff, whether it's coming from the strength training or coming from running short and fast.
Mm,
But they need to
mm-hmm.
do something so that their fast twitch fibers don't completely atrophy, because then you lose muscle power and
Yeah.
strength. And that affects quality of life. It doesn't just affect running, it affects daily living.
Definitely, definitely. And so in into menopause, when women's estrogen is declined or has declined or is steadily declining through perimenopause, how does that affect? We mentioned the carbohydrate loading or doing that high intensity work for a menstruating female during that lower hormone phase, that follicular phase. Does that mean perimenopausal or sorry, postmenopausal women are just as effective as follicular phase menstruating women at carbohydrate loading?
Uh, that's an interesting question. I don't know if any studies have looked at, have compared carbohydrate loading in
Mm,
postmenopause versus premenopause,
mm-hmm.
and how that changes across the menstrual cycle. Yeah, I'd have to look up those studies, see if anything's been done on that.
Yeah.
But in general, menopause, metabolic rate is lower,
Mm,
and so you need to eat more and do more exercise just to maintain metabolic rate, because you lose a lot of muscle mass as you get older, and so that affects metabolism, that affects metabolic rates, and so there's still going to be a need there to consume more calories.
Yeah. So for the women in that group, that perimenopausal and menopausal group, to minimize those lean mass losses, you mentioned like doing more high intensity work, maybe strength training. Are there other things to help keep that muscle around that women can do?
Yeah, well, both the combination of the strength training and protein in the diet, that's key.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that that aligns with a lot of the stuff we tell our clients as well that are perimenopausal and menopausal. I think that's a good tip, and it's always good for them to hear it too from someone who's done their research and knows.
Training has a greater effect on the older population to maintain resting metabolic rate than it does on a younger population.
Okay. Yeah.
How much it affect muscle mass? I mean, a 25-year-old, they already have plenty of muscle mass. They could strength train to try. They could train like a bodybuilder and make more muscle mass, but if they just did normal strength training, it's not going to affect their metabolic rate.
Yeah.
A person who's lost muscle mass over the years has a much greater impact on their metabolic rate, and it can preserve the metabolic rate. So strength training has huge ramifications for the older population.
Yeah. And what do you have, like a rough rule of thumb of like how many times or how many days a week someone should strength train for?
I mean, that all depends on what they've been doing before. So, I mean, initially, maybe once a week. If you're doing nothing, then once a week could be a stimulus. But then you adapt to that stimulus, and then you may need twice a week. And so there's no one general rule. It all depends on just finding where your starting point is, and then over time, you increase from that starting point.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's an excellent suggestion. To kind of ties back to a lot of these recommendations or stuff that we see in the literature is a great place to start, but then also everybody is so individual, like you're saying. Where did they come from? What's their training background like? So I think that's a good kind of thing to keep in mind. Do you talk about hormone replacement therapy at all in your books, or have you researched much of that for the perimenopausal athlete?
There's 2 chapters in that book, one on menopause and then one on older women, so even much older than menopause. And the book goes into some detail about both oral contraceptives during the time the woman is menstruating, and then hormone replacement therapy afterward. And so, I mean, that's kind of a mixed bag, because you have to, and this is a conversation people have to have with their OBGYN to just make that decision, because there are some side effects of the hormone replacement therapy. It's been linked to an increase in breast cancer risk, and so even though it can be beneficial because you're supplying yourself with estrogen, and that can be beneficial for your bones, you have to weigh that against the potential risks involved. And so that's why you have to look at your health history and have that discussion with your OBGYN to decide, am I a good candidate for hormone replacement therapy, or is the risk greater than the benefit?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's smart. And I think I had heard that there's different types too of the hormone replacement therapy, meaning, are you utilizing estrogen and progesterone, or is your doctor prescribing one or not the other, and what is better or maybe not, worse for the individual, and kind of keeping that in mind too. I think it's important, to speak with your professional about that. And then I know your book dives into the female athlete triad, and I think that's probably a whole other podcast topic. And I think our listeners have heard us touch on it here and there for sure. But with that, obviously injuries can be one of the common things seen there. And with kind of talking about our female athletes, like just in general, not taking into consideration female athlete triad, but are there certain injuries that you see, out of curiosity, occur more in female runners compared to men?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, women do have more incidence of knee injuries than men do. But in general, if a woman does not have any issues with her menstrual cycle and she's normally menstruating every month, then women are not at an increased risk of running-related injuries compared to men. It's only become a problem when there are menstrual irregularities. And so the three parts of the female athlete triad, which has recently been given a new fancy name, now it's called RED-S. The emphasis is on the energy deficiency. And so that's why they renamed it RED-S, relative energy deficiency syndrome, because women, just like men, can do an enormous amount of training. The body can handle a lot. But when women supply themselves with enough energy because they're lacking in calories, that's when they become energy deficient, and that's when things start to fall apart, and they get menstrual irregularities or maybe complete dysfunction of the menstrual cycle. And so in those conditions, then yes, a woman is a greater risk than a man for specific injuries, most notably a stress fracture. Because losing your menstrual cycle, you don't have the protective effect of estrogen, and then the bones are at risk. So if you keep increasing the training under those conditions, you could potentially be at risk for getting a stress fracture.
I mean, we see that unfortunately in many of the endurance athlete worlds for sure. It's very unfortunate. And these athletes are
young, like NCAA athletics.
It's
cross country and track teams have a big problem with stress fractures.
It's a bummer, and many of the athletes are putting in a lot of hours, and it's sometimes the running too specifically like decreases appetite for a while post that training session. So there's that decreased inclination to eat. So sometimes it's fully unintentional, but then it's just hard to keep up. And so that's definitely an area of education, I think, that's really important for that group. So we're getting close on time here today. So we'll tie it up, but I know there was probably so many other topics and rabbit holes we could have gone down into here today. But if you, again, want to check out Dr. Karp and his work that he's doing with the runners in Kenya, we're going to link his GoFundMe page so you guys can help out with that and help his runners get to some races and perform and show all their hard work and put it out there. And then he has several books. We're going to link definitely the one we talked about today. We'll put the other ones in the show notes for you guys. And anything else you want to mention, Jason, or share with the listeners?
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't promote my recent TED Talk, because I think a lot of the listeners would really love it. I mean, the title is How Running Like an Animal Makes Us Human. So it talks all about, how we tend to forget that we're animals, and how running, just like for animals, changes us on the inside. So the talk is all about not working from the inside out. Forget about what people talk about. Work on your mind and your inside, and get I poo-poo that a little bit, and I talk about how it's all about working from the outside in, and remembering that we're animals first. And so if your physical body strong and resilient and enduring, that changes you on the inside. It starts with the physical, because the human existence is physical.
Definitely. I will say I have watched the TED Talk a couple times, and every time I watched it made me want to go run. So
very good.
Yes. So we will link that also in the show notes for the listeners to check out as well, and get some motivation to get out there and run if they're needing it for any reason. And then, like I mentioned, we'll include your books. And then, are you still taking on any clients for the Kyniska Running coaching? Can we link?
All the time. Okay. I mean, that's all an online platform. So definitely.
Awesome. Well, we will send people that way. And again, thank you so much for your time. This was amazing. I'm sure people are going to have tons of nuggets to pull from this conversation we had today. And I'm sure we could have you back for a whole nother topic, maybe on the female athlete triad or RED-S or something of that nature as well. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you for having me.